Welcome to another edition of HSRC Connect. This is Odidi Matai-Sigutla and I'll be hosting today's panel discussion titled Johannesburg from the Riverbanks, Navigating the Jukskei. Before we explore the book and its inspirations and contributions, I'd like to welcome our esteemed guests, Professor Mehita Iqani, Shareholder of the South African Research Chair in Science Communication at Stellenbosch University, Dr. Renugan Raidoo, Lecturer in Social Anthropology at Stellenbosch University, Jane Eagle, former Deputy Director of Open Space Planning, and Paul Maluleke, founding member of the Alexandra Water Warriors. It's an honor to have you all here. Now, Johannesburg is often described as a city without a river, yet the Jukskei running from beneath the Ellis Park through Alexandra, gated estates and beyond to Hartbeespoort reveals a different story. The book of the same title as our topic frames the Jukskei as both an environmental and cultural artifact. So, Prof. Iqani, how does this framing challenge conventional narratives of Johannesburg as a city without water?
Thank you so much for having us here today. That's a really great question to start on. Johannesburg, or who know the city well, or who've moved there in their life to seek their fortunes or make their lives, don't see it as a city that is associated with a large body of water. It's obviously not on the coast, so there's no ocean, and there are no big lakes, and there are no huge rivers that run through the middle of it the same way with other big cities, thinking of places like Lagos or London or Paris or, just there are many examples. So a lot of Joburgers often don't realize that there is actually a lot of water in the city. And in fact, the city of Joburg was built on top of a wetland that forms the origin of a river that ultimately runs out of the eastern side of the city of Joburg and winds its way around Ekurhuleni and through a range of different parts of the northern suburbs and eventually connects with the Hartbeespoort Dam before it then joins the Crocodile River and then the Limpopo and then spills into the Indian Ocean at Shai in Mozambique. So there is something special about the fact that there is a river and many tributaries to that river in Johannesburg, which many Johannesburgers and people who think about Joburg don't realize and don't know. And part of the reason this book exists is because we were becoming enlightened about the presence of the river, partly due to some incredible activist work that is being done to try and save the river, because as you will hear later on in this conversation, it is polluted, it is struggling, it is neglected, and it needs to be loved and cleaned up so that it can contribute to the city and all the people who live there in positive ways. So this book is really the end of quite a long conversation that's happened between many people. There are 22 contributors to this book, and each of them has engaged with, worked with, interacted with, or studied the river in some way. And what Renugan and I have done in the editing work of this book is to try and bring those voices together into one place to show the river, not only that it exists and to show its complexities, but also to highlight it as a really important social, cultural, and environmental asset for the city of Joburg. But that is also about a broader conversation about how all rivers in the country need the same attention, the same love, the same interest, and the same scholarship. So Joburg is like a case study here, but the big conversation that we need to be having, I think, out of the content in this book is about all of the rivers in this country and how they interact with towns and cities, and whether we're doing enough as citizens, as government, as communities to look after these really important resources.
Jane Eagle, given the urgent realities of climate change and flooding in urban areas, how can cities like Johannesburg reimagine river systems as assets for resilience rather than liabilities?
Well, as Mehita said, these rivers are really important. And one thing I don't know if everyone knows, that the Jukskei actually contributes the majority of the water source for the whole of Gauteng, because it does flow into Hartbeespoort, which supplies everybody. So, you know, we just assume that water will always be there, and we can always draw on the dam to sustain the city. But the problem of flooding is the sort of other side of the coin. So a river represents the source of water, but also it becomes a problem, because if you dump all the water into the river, your flooding becomes a real challenge. So what we have been trying to advocate, and in fact some of the work that we'll talk about later, that Water for the Future, a really nice NGO that I'm also now part of, is trying to learn lessons from nature about how to slow water down, put it back into the ground as close to where the rain is falling, and not treat the river like the drain, because the typical engineering approach is you dump all water, you get it off the road as fast as possible. It's a very efficient system. You dump it into a pipe, you dump it into a culvert, and so it gathers momentum, and then finally you have an even bigger pipe and you dump it into the river. And of course that causes huge problems. You're pushing up your flood peaks, and that has all sorts of other damage that goes along with it. And now with climate change, what we're finding is we're getting the same rain in a much shorter time. So the systems don't cope. You see water bubbling out of culverts, they cause problems on the roads, and then ultimately your flood peaks in the river are going up. So if you're looking at how you can protect yourself from that, you might not be able to change the rainfall patterns, but you can make the landscape more resilient by getting that water to go into the ground as quickly as possible. So what we've been trying to advocate is more permeability in the whole catchment, which means keeping your green spaces, planting trees, not paving everywhere. And you know, developers love to pave. Everyone loves paving. It's more efficient. Green is difficult to maintain. And you know, you get resistance from people. They don't want to have to go and clean a green ditch. They see it as a green ditch. They'd much rather go and sweep a nice concrete canal. So changing the mindset is really difficult, because people are quite resistant to that, and there's something about nature seen as backward, concrete is seen as progress, and we really have to change that mindset. So, you know, you have to bring in regulation sometimes to make people do things, but it's quite nice if you can persuade people to look at rivers in a different way and start understanding that everything you do from the top of the hill down to the valley is going to impact on that river. So if you can keep water back and not dump it in the river, you are much better off. And just the other side of that, you can also hold that water back, and you can create opportunities to harness some of that water and reuse it, which when you're faced with droughts, with climate change, every drop of water is a resource. And you know, traditionally we see stormwater as something you throw away. It's a problem. So changing the mindset, and then trying to change the way that we manage rainwater. You know, people call it rainwater, but as it hits the ground, it's suddenly stormwater. It's the same water. So that is really the starting point, yeah. And trying to protect all our green spaces as opposed to developing over all of them.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And from a planning perspective, what were the biggest challenges you encountered in integrating rivers like the Jukskei into Johannesburg's green infrastructure and open space systems?
Well, sort of following on from what I've said is that, you know, obviously there's a contestation for space. It's a massive city with huge urbanization, massive in-migration to the city, and space is at a premium. And so when, you know, at the level of big developers who are developing large estates, or, you know, everybody wants to build on as much land as they can. So the challenge of trying to get them to respect the floodplain and say, but there's a river here and we actually need to give this river its space. If you look at natural rivers, if you ever look at a time series of a natural river, it meanders. A river doesn't stay in one space. But our legislation assumes that a river is a static thing, and it says you can build to the 1 in 50-year floodline or the 1 in 100-year floodline, as if that thing is cast in stone, is never going to change. But now we have climate change, it's changing those floodlines, and we've built over half the land that, you know, it used to be absorbing the water, so we change the floodlines. But we tell the river you have to go there, so you end up having to canalize rivers, which is, again, turning them into a drain, not a living life force. So trying to get developers, first of all, to respect space and to allocate space to a river is the first challenge. And then that's sort of at the high level, but then at a local level, you've also got rivers become the space that all the homeless people, you know, hide out in because it's the easiest place to hide, and you've got communities who are just stealing a little bit more and a little bit more of the river all the time. We've got in Joburg, the Jukskei is really struggling with that because we've got illegal dumping that sort of creates artificial space on the edge of the river, and then people build there. A, they're not safe. B, you are choking the river, and that water is going to go somewhere and it's going to affect someone else downstream. So that whole, you know, trying to create space for the river really is the first challenge, and trying to get people to design with the river, to actually see the river as an asset, not a liability. You know, in the old days, developers liked to just build to the back and build a wall, and then that was the river. Now we're saying, turn to the river, face the river, embrace the river, celebrate the river. It's an asset. And, you know, if you just want to look at it from a hard economic point of view, there are estates who have demonstrated that the properties that sell for the highest value are the ones next to the water. It's obvious. And why do communities settle next to the water? Because it's a resource and they depend on it. So, you know, we'll talk maybe a bit later about working with people who are trying to make people see rivers in a different way. But the challenge is really a space. In the first instance, it's a contestation over space. It's a battle for space. So once you allow a river to make space, you can do all sorts of things with that river now. You can create the asset value that you want. But that's been the biggest challenge. And politically also, you know, because every ounce of development represents more money in the coffers. So space is the contestation in a city like Johannesburg, yeah.
Thank you. And Paul Maluleke, the Alex Water Warriors have been at the forefront of grassroots river activism. What strategies have you found most effective in mobilizing communities to protect the Jukskei?
I think on our side as a community, we sort of have different challenges. But then personally, as a community leader from the tourism background, we have something called responsible tourism. So Jukskei River is one of our heritage sites, and then our tourism organization, its title is Greater Alexandra Tourism and Heritage Association. So one of the obligations we have is to protect our heritage site. So Jukskei River as a heritage site, it needed to be protected, but then it's obviously that the people who are polluting in the river, it's some of the community members. But then we had like concerned community members that live along the river, and then more especially from the spirituality point of view, whereby we've got your traditional healers and other individuals that are doing their rituals on the river. So they also had like challenges. But then on our side, to be honest, we have a space called the Hub Presents. It's a tourism attraction. And then we used to see like a lot of unsustainable developments happening. But then on our side again, looking at the challenges we have in Gauteng in terms of the water scarcity, sometimes like our taps run dry, and it's obvious like to use like water, you use it for different sources, like for bathing, washing, let alone drinking, because you can buy bottled water. But then for washing, it's obviously like the water cannot be used, for bathing cannot be used. But then what was important again was to say, let's start like cleaning the river, and also making sure that we want to create like your green jobs again. But then again, the issue of climate change, it came into play again. And the biggest challenge, to be honest, it was the information. We didn't have like enough information on how to mitigate against climate change. But then with the river, in 2017, we proposed that we want to rehabilitate the Jukskei River and transform it into a tourism attraction. And then we started by doing like smaller cleaning campaigns just to make sure that we profile like our work. But then the biggest impact was done in 2021 when we started like with a whole lot of 250 team members and then other corporate companies, because during COVID we get an opportunity to start like researching and developing some ideas on how are we going to start cleaning the river. But then again, the issue of unemployment is real. So the river currently is employing plus minus 1,500 individuals, although we have 3,000 volunteers. So our base is volunteerism, but then it's obviously like we cannot like keep on volunteering. We need to make sure that we pay people. But Water Warriors does not have funds, so we have our funders, which is like assisting us to basically make sure that our work is easy. At first, we were struggling with like cleaning equipments, materials, and then also the other thing was to make sure that as a community organization, we start like attracting investment portfolios in our communities. So, but the river currently, we haven't basically reached our objectives to make sure that the river is in a good state. We're still trying by all means to make sure that as a community we unite, we understand what is the river, and then also to make sure that we create like carriers around the river or carriers around the environmental sector. So as you know that we've got like women, we've got children, we've got the youth, which is like we need to make sure that they are part of the environmental solution. So currently the biggest thing that is happening is the unity, and then learning how to work with each other as the community, and also making sure that we create like that sustainable working relationship, more especially with government. But then some of the strategies that we have used, personally, I'm the community leader. And then it's obvious, like in a community, there is that one leader whereby people will always make sure that they understand him or her, and also make sure that they support his ambitions. But then with the river again, we felt that it's a space which is like, we wanted to make sure that we build a legacy, more especially for our children. In Alex, it's very congested, the streets are full, they are narrow. But in the river, it has parks, which is like on the weekends, on any day, like our community members can go and use those spaces. But to be honest, I'm happy that the impact that we have done to mobilize the community, it was the biggest thing, because most of our community members, they are also coming from other provinces, whereby they've got also the similar challenges. So they are currently learning. And then some of them, they're also taking like courses around like water training programs and other greening programs. But then the most important thing currently was to also to create that consistency in terms of cleaning the river. So from Monday to Friday, we're at the river. Weekends, we need to rest. And then what I like most is we don't actually push anyone to come and volunteer or work on the river. Like now it's a lifestyle. So if we didn't go to the river, we don't feel like nothing we have done. But then we're happy that at least we are connecting with our local schools, our local councillors, they are also supporting us. And then the businesses as well, they're coming to understand what is it's happening within those spaces. The businesses, again, because they are responsible for most of the pollution and the litter, we actually encourage them to, on a monthly basis, they come and visit the space and then see what kind of products like they are making like a negative impact. But I'm happy that our community, to be honest, they themselves, like they are self-driven in terms of making sure that the river is like in a good state.
Thank you. And Dr. Raidoo, your research highlights lifestyle estates and urban spatial dynamics. How does the Jukskei illuminate Johannesburg's entrenched inequalities between informal settlements like Alexandra and elite estates such as Dainfern?
Well, thank you for having us. Yes and no is my answer. It does highlight the entrenched inequalities, but one of the things that made the river interesting to me and I think to us was that for a city like Johannesburg that is so often written about in terms of its walls, in terms of its urban segregation, all of which are very real, the Jukskei was one feature of the environment that kind of cuts through all of that. And water always runs downhill, and that's kind of something that nobody can escape. And so even in lifestyle estates, people who have managed to, through mobilizing capital, build golf estates and live in sanitized environments, still have to encounter things like litter that comes from the inner city, not that they don't do their own polluting from gated estates as well, and smells from the sewage that is let into the river. And it also highlights, I think attention to the river also highlights, and throughout the book you'll see this, how different people, how the way people think and use the river is dependent on unequal urban planning. So the reason there is illegal dumping is an extension of bad service delivery, right? In the river, a lot of the larger pieces of debris that do end up in the Gulf estates and getting caught in their litter traps are a result of the flooding of informal settlements like Chuetla, where people who have been displaced from other areas of Johannesburg for developers and have been put there, but have ended up having to build so close to the river that homes get washed away in Alexandra. And so the stuff that is in the river also, so as a metaphor, it kind of cuts across and connects all these unequal areas, but also the material of the river, the things that it takes with it, make the entrenched inequalities of the city present to everyone who lives and encounters the river.
Thank you. And so Dr. Raidoo, in chapter 17, you explore how elites think of the Jukskei. What do these perceptions reveal about race, class, and property politics in Johannesburg today?
I think, so where I ended off my last response was with how different people perceive the river. And Jane mentioned in her answer that it attracts homeless people because there's room along the banks. One of our authors, Sarah Charlton, writes about the unhoused who live along one of the tributaries to the Jukskei. But the people who live along the Jukskei in the places that I study, like golf estates, treat it very differently. For them, it's an aesthetic resource, and so they want it to be kept clean and pristine and free of all of the signs of urban inequality that they're trying to avoid every day. And so the ways in which they talk about litter and the smells in the river often reflect ideas about post-apartheid governance and its admitted failures, about the way people talk about it often reinforces the idea that that people in Alex are irresponsible, as if building a golf course with a large spatial footprint is responsible urban development. And so the stories people tell about their encounters with the river are what reinforce their ideas about class and race. To provide one example, there was a woman in the vignette that I tell in the chapter, there was a woman who tried to organize a cleanup day for the river. But every time she tried to organize it, the estate said, no, we can't stop golf for a day, because golf is a big revenue generator for the estate, right? And she said, okay, well, can we have it on a public holiday so that like children can be involved? Because there was a public holiday that fell on a Monday, I think, and there's no golf on a Monday. But every time there is a public holiday on the Monday, the golf estate does open, because it means that everybody has the day off, and so they can generate more revenue. And so they kept making it more and more difficult for this woman who wanted to make a difference and to change children's and residents' perception of the river. So instead, every time it floods, and so when litter does come over the litter traps, they hire a private company to do all of the cleanup. And so their relationship is regulated through the estate and through the homeowners association.
So would you say that when you compare the elites and those living in Alexandra, would you say that the elites do not care as much as the community in Alexandra about the river, as long as it doesn't give or hinder their source of income? Or are there ways that they are also trying to be within the green climate, green thumb ways of life, or are they just not caring because it doesn't give any source of income to them?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons that the river has been neglected was because it never provided much of a source of income. Even though gold was first found there, it's not where the landlords made their money, right? But I wouldn't say the elites don't care. I would say that they care about different things and for different reasons. Look, there are plenty of ways to have a green thumb. You can be a very neoliberal conservationist and want to, and historically in South Africa we have kicked people off land in order to conserve the nature, as if people weren't already living within nature, and as if in urban environments we don't live with nature. I would say that, and this is to make broad generalizations, elites think about the river as, and they care about the river as a resource of beautification, of an attraction to the golf course. It even features in, I think, 3 of the holes on the golf course, because, like, in the design of the course, at least the course that where I did most of my research. But it doesn't, and it only appears problematic when it violates those beauty standards. So when it starts to smell, when there's foam at certain junctures of the river, then it becomes a problem, and then the entire city makes itself kind of materially present in the golf estate. Whereas I think if you are someone who lives in dangerously close to its banks, which Paul can talk more about, you kind of can't, it's probably not an aesthetic resource. You're in constant peril, particularly during the summer when we have lots of, which is the rainy season in Joburg. You're continually in peril of your house being washed away. And so I think rivers kind of make themselves present, but the ways in which elites care about it and people who live in other sections of the riverbanks care about it are different.
Okay. So, Prof. Iqani, you emphasize science communication for social justice. How can communication from the Jukskei catalyze public awareness and policy change around urban environmental justice?
There's a lot to think with in that question. So I think, as you've already heard from my esteemed co-panelists, this river carries many stories. Renugan and I, in the introduction to this book, write about something that we call riparian urbanism. So what that means to us is a theoretical framework for thinking about how the river is a lived and social and cultural artifact, right? It's not just a body of water that passes through. It's a body of water that lives in relationship with all the human beings and other species who live on the banks of the river and who kind of interact with that water in one way or another, whether it's through horror or activism or extractivism or policy making. There is a very strong social, cultural set of questions that are linked to the existence of any river, but especially a river that runs through a dense, complicated, diverse city like Johannesburg. So I was attracted to this river as a domain for thinking about science communication for social justice, because it's impossible to understand the river properly without science, but it's also impossible to understand the river properly without integrating the human and the complexities of human life, human societies. And I would argue communication as not only a set of practices, but also a set of philosophies and a set of research questions is the glue that can bring together scientific issues and social issues. And the river gives an opportunity, any river, but this river specifically gives an opportunity to actually put those questions and practices into exercise, right? So, for example, Water for the Future, the organization that Jane is here representing, started a few years ago to try and rejuvenate this one section of the river, which is where it first sees the daylight after flowing underneath Hillbrow, where it emerges, to rejuvenate the couple of blocks at the daylight point. And that was when I first learned about the river properly and learned about the work that was being done. And Water for the Future was bringing together scientists and community leaders and children in the community and business people and artists to all come and think about how to solve this problem of this river that is neglected, that is polluted, that is ignored, and that could be something beautiful and valuable for the whole community. And stories are at the heart of all of that work, right? The stories that are told about the river, the ways in which the river itself tells stories and communicates. And all of that storytelling requires some form of communication. So for me, this case study of the Jukskei River is a really exciting opportunity for thinking about what science communication can be, and kind of exploding the idea of science communication as this linear from scientist to everyone else, which is, not really what communication is meant to be. We're not all just meant to be sitting in the audience and listening to scientists tell us what's right and wrong and what the facts are. No, we need to be in a dialogue. Everyone who is somehow touched by an issue where science is central needs to be part of a dialogue, a conversation. And that dialogue and conversation needs to happen in multiple modalities. It needs to be artistic, it needs to be social, it needs to be anthropological, it needs to be policy-driven, it needs to be technical, it needs to be spiritual, it needs to be all of those things. And this case study of this river has been such an enlightening way of exploring what science communication for social justice can and should be, because it is such a tangible case study for thinking about what communication is and how it can operate in service of social justice, right, and environmental justice at the same time. Yeah, that's what I have to say about that question.
Thank you. And Jane Eagle, how can local government, private developers, and communities collaborate more effectively to balance development pressures with ecological protection in urban riverscapes?
Well, the first thing I was thinking about when Mehita was speaking and Renugan is that one of the stakeholders in this conversation hasn't even been mentioned, and that is biodiversity. And actually in cities, rivers are the connectors that allow biodiversity to survive. That almost becomes the only space left for them to migrate from one part of the city to the other. So I'm just putting a thing saying maybe we must think not only about social justice, also environmental justice, because you know, they're important stakeholders. So talking about collaborating, you know, at a basic level, I think what the river has also, and in a way, what the stakeholders like these NGOs that are working so well with the river have put on into perspective, or they've highlighted it, is that local government must first of all get its act together. They must first do the job that they are supposed to be doing, which is fixing the infrastructure, not dumping huge amounts of sewage into the river. So there's a basic governance service delivery issue that has to be taken care of, because you know, you can harness the power of people and communities to look after the river, but they can't fix it if other role players are not doing their part, because it becomes unsustainable and quite demoralizing. But then there is a way, and I mean, I think Renugan's, you know, highlighted the communities downstream who suddenly becoming more aware of the river and of conditions upstream, because they're forced to, because it arrives at their doorstep. So we are finding a lot more interest in those big, more, you know, well-to-do estates in actually either directly funding initiatives to try and clean up the river at source, or themselves becoming part of the solution in direct intervention. So we've also got some developers who, just from a sort of overall resilience, not just a litter point of view, but overall resilience and celebrating of the river, are starting to come to the party to do pilot, you know, to plan differently, to say, okay, we'll take a chance and design our estates differently or design our developments differently. So there's a paradigm shift, I think, that we're trying to get, is that just people must think about space and think about the type of typologies that buildings and how they design these estates. So that, you know, there's a lot of mindset change. But then harnessing the power of communities is becoming really, I think, where the most action is happening. Certainly at the moment, it's almost communities are saying, you know, if government's not going to do that, but we're going to take charge because we care about the river. And I do think that's across the board. I don't think it's that some care and some don't care, but they are taking charge, and so I think one is trying to get that collaboration going by supporting those NGOs like Water for the Future, who has really just been transformative in getting people to even see the river that was forgotten. It was put into a canal, and so everyone thought it was sort of almost like a drain. There was just that dirty canal that somehow came, and they didn't see it connected to the beautiful river that then winds out further downstream. So just to actually get people to first of all see that this water comes from somewhere, it's actually a natural feature, I think has been totally transformative. And then even from a scientific point of view, it's been shown that if communities start to take litter out of the river and manage the vegetation, you even reduce things like flooding, you reduce damage to infrastructure, so other problems that then might become an issue. The water pipe goes and you don't have water. If you're looking after the river, you even secure some of those things as well. So I think that's the biggest thing, is trying to give all the support you can to people, and they're working at all levels, because, you know, educating people about not to put wet wipes down a toilet, or taxis not to pour their oil change down the stormwater drain because it's actually going to come out in the river. You've got to work with all those communities who are somehow impacting on the river downstream, because otherwise Paul is going to be forever cleaning what someone else dumped upstream. And I think that is one of the challenges, that often the people who are cleaning are not necessarily the ones who were polluting. In Alex, maybe sometimes it's different because there's a direct relationship. You're dumping and you're also living there. But there's a lot of waste, because the water is always moving. It's often bringing debris from, you know, a school where taxis are picking up kids and they just clear their taxis. I mean, the things I see, there's just a sea of waste. The next rainstorm comes, mobilizes all that waste, dumps it in the river, and Paul's guys must clean it a week later off the riverbank. So trying to get that education from source to impact is, I think, a real challenge, and something. So you might be working in an area that's not apparently related to the river, but it's actually in some way very, very directly related to that river. So those are, you know, there's so many layers of collaboration, I think, in looking after a river. And one other thing is that food has become a big issue, and around Water for the Future, I think they've seen that, you know, people have a relation to the river because they also can grow food from that water if you can clean it. So that's also another thing, that it's actually some people are dependent on that river for, you know, even for food. And so that's been also quite another angle. And then lastly, I also wanted to say from just some of the work that Water for the Future has been doing around changing the vegetation, that's often not seen as having an impact on the river, but she is, this NGO that I'm very fortunate to still have a relationship with, has been skilling themselves. They started with water quality and now they've suddenly become skilled in alien control, because replanting the catchment with natural vegetation is helping to recharge, put more water back into the ground, also filter that water, because natural vegetation holds water better often than artificial, you know, than non-indigenous vegetation. And so that transformation at the head of this river, which has a long life, as Mehita has said, but you know, you start at the beginning and then you try and work downstream to fix this river. And I think there's you know, if you're a spiritual person, there's a real healing effect in actually giving hope to this river and hope to the communities who live downstream from that river. And to me, that has been incredibly powerful. Just the art on the front of this book, when you see it in real life at this daylight point where the water finally sees daylight, is very moving actually, and very heartwarming, and makes you believe it is possible to fix this river, which is quite a daunting task. Yeah.
And are there any educational workshops or functions that you guys are having for the community to educate them on how to actually take care of the river, such as not dumping oil or wet wipes?
Well, I think Water for the Future does a lot of that. In their day-to-day programs, they are doing, while they're cleaning, they're educating not only the workers, but also they've got outreach, the community days they have. So I think there's a lot of work happening around that. I mean, government's doing, you know, a whole lot too, but just in terms of what these direct actors are doing, there's a lot that they are doing, but they're integrating it with the programs that they, you know, the skills development and the actual cleanup programs that they are doing.
Okay, thank you. And Paul Maluleke, how do you see the role of local activism in holding municipalities accountable for pollution and neglect of rivers like the Jukskei?
Yeah, I think on my side, as a former government official.
You also one.
Yeah. So accountability, it's something else, because we all have to be accountable. But from the municipal point of view, I believe most of the government officials, they're also coming from our communities. But in the spaces that they find themselves working from, they're totally different from what they're coming from. But I think on their side as well, it's a matter of having those working relationships amongst ourselves. It's just that most of our community development is politically motivated. That is why it becomes a challenge. But now we have said, look, let's put politics aside and focus on socialism, whereby as communities will come together, we won't complain about anyone, and then we'll also learn to manage our expectations. But then on my side, my activism started like after World Summit on Sustainable Development, because it was an eye-opener. But then the biggest frustration was, it seems like I was alone from Alex, whereby I was going to have that role to sort of like speak to the objectives of the summit. But then fortunately we have like youth, which is like they've studied like environmental courses, but then the problem now is they don't have opportunities. But then I think the lack of education and awareness programs, and now I know from the government point of view, because we've got different environmental entities, they all have educational programs. We now recently realized that we must make sure that we are working with them. But from the community point of view, note that our biggest challenge is innovation. But for now, with municipality, we didn't have that working relationship from the councillors, from the relevant departments. So to hold them accountable without any working relationship is a challenge. But now we have a working relationship whereby we can sit together at the table and decide who must do what. But at the same time, we cannot be pointing the municipality and then not doing anything. But we had to also, on our side, to start doing something so that, like, on a later stage, we can hold them accountable. But then we've been careful in terms of holding accountable, because, like, we had to conduct like a research and development to understand who are these people that we're dealing with. Only to find out that most of our municipal officials, they don't really understand the river as well. So it's not an easy thing. But then on our side as well, we are a very vulnerable community whereby most of the rubble that is coming, that is in Alex or is dumped like in the rivers, it's not coming from Alex. Because in Alex, we don't actually destroy, we build. We don't have houses. It's just that now whereby, like, you have to renovate your house, where you have to demolish some of the spaces. But a large part of the rubble is coming from well-established areas like your Sentin and all that stuff, because they always demolish buildings. They have to build more buildings and make some improvements. And then our landfills, like, are full. So hence I'm saying that there's political interference, like, in between, but then as a community as well, because we are vulnerable, we want to have, like, resources to work. We have to be strategic in terms of making sure who must be accountable for the river. But then what I know, it's the national government is far from us, because Jukskei River, one of the owners, it's Department of Water and Sanitation. And it's obviously, like, from the local point of view and provincial point of view, to get the interactions or to get to communicate with, like, government, it's obvious you have to be representative or represented from, or you have to represent a certain organization. So, but for us, like, from the Water Warrior point of view, the pressure came from tourism again. So we use tourism to make sure that we get, like, enough attention. And it's obviously, like, whatever words we presented to government officials in terms of making sure that they give us support for the river, the tourism business opportunities and the reality, it what caught their eyes. But on our side, in terms of accountability, our community now, the community that resides along the Jukskei River, we have conducted a lot of education and awareness. But then the biggest challenge again is the service delivery again. There's no enough service delivery, because some of the informal settlements, the municipal cleaners, like, they pick it up, cannot really go into those spaces. Sometimes it can be dangerous. But then the problem now is alternative spaces where to dispose your waste. But then again, there's a program where I think the city was supposed to be instrumental, whereby they wanted to make sure that as community or household, we source our waste from the source. I mean, we sort our waste from the source, but the problem was the implementation part of the program. So Water Warriors, it's here to make sure that there is, like, enough accountability from both sides, from the community and government, and also from private sector. So, but at this stage, I think after some few years is whereby we can really hold them accountable. But then for now, we wanted to make sure that we create that healthy working relationship amongst ourselves, because we don't have resources to clean the river. They do have the resources to clean the river. So it was best for us to start smiling, and then later, and then we can have like a robust conversations. So in terms of negligence, there's an issue of bylaws again. So this is one of my biggest challenge from accountability, to say we are not getting enough support from government in terms of like the bylaws. As a community, we cannot implement bylaws, but the community can. I mean, the government must come in on that.
Then thank you. It seems that we are running out of time. So shall quickly wrap up. So with the last, Dr. Raidoo and Professor Iqani, can you quickly answer these questions? To Dr. Raidoo, how can anthropological insights into everyday urban life help bridge the gap between environmental research and community realities along the riverbanks? And Professor Iqani, the volume brings together scientists, artists, and activists. What lessons did you learn about the power and limitations of interdisciplinary collaborations in telling the story of the Jukskei? Starting with Dr. Raidoo.
Actually, my answer is probably an answer to both questions, because so first of all, I think what this book does by being multidisciplinary is to write against the idea that that we have defined disciplines, right? To understand something as complex as a river, or even to encounter something as and conceive and think of dealing with something as complex as climate change, requires all of us to work together. The knowledge that I can gather as an anthropologist who works along the banks and can only interview a certain number of people and live with a certain number of people is inadequate to deal with the scale of the problem itself. And so what the book tries to do is make scientists realize that their work is also social, to make social scientists realize that that quantitative work is also very valuable to our collective dealing with the river. And I'll let Mehita finish, but the second thing I'll say about that is, if by an anthropological lens we mean dealing with looking at the river from the ground, it's also important when we think of maps and kind of urban planning and the history of urban planning, we tend to see the river as kind of a line on a map from an aerial point of view. And so I think bringing it from the aerial, from a kind of God's eye or bird's eye point of view, to a view from standing at the banks and encountering the material reality of what's flowing through the river and the seasonal variation in the banks is important to understanding what a river actually is. And that planning cannot happen when it's just a blue line on a map drawn from above.
So I'll say something to conclude about interdisciplinarity. I think interdisciplinarity is first and foremost about listening to knowledge as it is produced and created by multiple actors. So this idea that knowledge is the domain of the university and that you have to have special degrees in certain subjects in order to create knowledge, it's incorrect, it's wrong. And that's the one thing that was really underlined for me in the work of this book, is because knowledge is produced in multiple ways. It's produced through community activism, it's produced through art, it's produced through the day-to-day work of hauling other people's waste out of the river by thousands of committed volunteers. Knowledge is produced by activists forging relationships with their communities and going together to look at the river and talk about it, as well as by the scientists who come and measure how many pathogens are present in the river or how much plastic waste is flowing past a particular point in the river. So for me, interdisciplinarity is really about respect for the multiple ways that knowledge is produced by human activity, human effort, human relationships. And that's something that I really feel the subject of this book has highlighted incredibly, and also to say that it is a project that is never complete. So there is always more knowledge to be created and shared and listened to. by one another. And I really hope that colleagues who are in the ivory tower especially will see our book as an opportunity to think differently about how listening to other knowledge creators outside of universities can really not only help their research to be more relevant and animated, but also to kind of shift their own preconceived ideas about, you know, what knowledge is and who owns it. Because, yeah, really the one thing this project has taught me is that there is no single story or set of knowledge that can sum up the river and what it means and how we can protect it and help it to help us, because we need the river more than the river needs us, and we need all of these forms of knowledge that come from all of these human activities and backgrounds and forms of life experience if we're actually going to find ways to solve some of the huge problems that are facing us as humanity.
Thank you. Well, thank you again to our esteemed guests, Professor Mehita Iqani, Dr. Renugan Raidoo, Jane Eagle, and Paul Maluleke for sharing their invaluable insights. For those interested in delving deeper, feel free to reach out to our panelists via the HSRC, and be sure to follow our YouTube channel for more pivotal topics such as this. Thank you all for participating in today's session, and to our viewers for joining us. It's been a pleasure on both ends. Let's continue the conversation until next time on HSRC Connect.
And cut. Just on citizens.